Today, we're in the District of Columbia and heading up to the rooftop of the Federal District of the United States. Hi, I'm Scott Marthaler. Welcome to Rooftops of America. Today, we are in Washington, D.C. While better known for its memorials, monuments, tourists, and as the home of the federal government, you can also have a fun high-pointing adventure while you're here. But before we start it, take a moment to click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates. This city is home to one of the most famous, or infamous, depending on your point of view, hills in the country. It's a safe bet that if you were to ask an American to name a hill in Washington, D.C., then this is the one they will answer with: Capitol Hill. Located on the eastern end of the National Mall, Capitol Hill is named after the structure that sits on top of it, the Capitol. It's hard to tell these days with everything built up around it, but it does actually sit on a hill. Jenkins Hill, to be exact. It was described as a hill waiting for a monument to be placed on it by Pierre Charles L'Enfant, one of the chief planners when the district was originally laid out. And that is what they did, placing there the young nation's legislature. The District of Columbia is a unique creation in the United States. It's not a state, nor is it a territory, but a federal district. So what exactly does that mean? And why do we have one? Well, the easy answer is it's spelled out in our Constitution, particularly Article 1, Section 8. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by cession of particular states, and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States. So why did the authors of the Constitution feel it was necessary in the first place? What was their motives for that? The answer actually can be found a few years prior to the Constitutional Convention, in an event that took place in 1783 in Philadelphia, the tail end of the American Revolution. Known as the Pennsylvania Mutiny of 1783, it involved soldiers surrounding the Congress building in Philadelphia, demanding their pay. When the state of Pennsylvania refused to send support to keep Congress safe and secure, Congress opted to finish its work elsewhere, eventually relocating the capital to New York City. This incident would have long-term ramifications. A few years later, James Madison, writing in Federalist Number 43, would state that the federal government would need the authority and autonomy to take care of its own affairs, basically being able to provide for its own maintenance and security. He'd carry this idea forward as one of the chief authors for the U.S. Constitution. So that explains the why we have a federal district. But how did it end up here? At the time, the metropolitan heart of the country would have been further north, split between Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and New York City, New York. So why is the district located here on the Potomac River between Virginia and Maryland, in a place at that time which was more akin to a wetland than the bustling metropolis of today? So, the Constitution, as we stated, established the federal district. But as you may have noticed in the language, there's no information on where said district had to be located. As you may expect, this became a significant point of political tension between the northern states and the southern states. It got to such a degree on where a position of this political power would be put that Congress was effectively deadlocked. In the end, the decision for the capital's location was made one night over dinner by three men in a closed room. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison brokered the deal on what went down in history as the Compromise of 1790. The South would get the national capital, and in turn, the federal government would be able to establish a strong fiscal system by taking over and paying the debts of the states. In 1790, the Residence Act was signed, establishing a federal district of 100 square miles with contributions from the states of Maryland and Virginia. The district itself was divided into two counties, separated by the Potomac, Washington County on the north and Alexandria County on the south. The district's original high point could be found on the southern side, close to the border with Virginia, a place called Miners Hill. The history of D.C.'s high points revolves around the fall line, a geological feature that is the dividing line between the Piedmont and coastal plain. The fall line runs for hundreds of miles up the eastern coast of the United States. In the early colonial days, it would have a major effect on where the English would settle. Seagoing ships could only go up the rivers to this point before they encountered rapids, falls, and other obstacles. That meant most of the early colonization efforts were focused on the coastal plain, leading to development of plantations focused on cash crops, such as tobacco and later cotton, which, in turn, increased the use of slave labor. The effects of the fall line wouldn't be surmounted for well over 100 years, until a more robust infrastructure was developed in the way of canals and roadways. The geological feature would be one of the reasons why the nation's capital would be placed where it is. Located near the boundary of the City of Falls Church in Fairfax County, Miners Hill has an elevation of 464 feet. The hill is named after the Miner family, who lived in this area at the end of the 18th century. While Miners Hill's time as the district high point was relatively brief, it did play a role in the district's history, particularly on one of the early city's darkest days. In 1812, the United States declared war on the British Empire over illegal impressment of sailors and blockade of neutral shipping to France. While the U.S. had declared war, things did not go well. It was unprepared for the conflict, and it suffered several defeats and setbacks. In 1814, the war came to the district when the British launched a raid to strike at the capital. American troops tried to halt the tide at Bladensburg in Maryland, but other than a valiant stand by U.S. Marines and sailors, U.S. militiamen were routed, opening the way for British forces to march on the city. In a coincidence, the commander of the Virginia militia that was supposed to reinforce U.S. troops at Bladensburg was Colonel George Miner, a member of the family that owned this hill. The Virginia troops never made it to the battlefield on time, though, having not been issued their flints and muskets in a timely fashion. But despite that snafu, they were able to save the gunpowder stores at the nearby Navy Yard and bring them safely to here, Miners Hill. The city was in a full-on panic, with people and militia troops pouring through it to get to the safety of the heights in Virginia and Maryland. One of those evacuees was the First Lady herself, Dolly Madison, whose diligence saved several national treasures from the enemy, most notably the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. When the British arrived, they set fire to the city, destroying significant portions of it. It's hard to imagine nowadays, but in August of 1814, from the top of this hill, you would have been able to witness the inferno as the flames engulfed Washington, D.C., as the British torched the government buildings throughout the city, including the White House. As one eyewitness would state,
"At first, I thought the world was on fire, and such a flame I have never seen since."
Falls Church in Miners Hill was swarming with refugees from the district, to include President Madison and members of his staff. His wife, Dolly Madison, was said to have spent the next several evenings at the home of the Miner family. The British didn't stay, marching back to their ships after the burning, and Miners Hill would soon return to its rural nature. Not all was well in the district, though. On the southern side, in Alexandria County, the citizens felt disenfranchised due to limited home rule, and there was a strong push to rejoin Virginia. In 1846, it became a reality. With the swipe of a pen, Miners Hill's reign as the district high point came to an end, with the retrocession of 31 square miles of territory in the south of the Potomac being returned to Virginia. D.C.'s new high point would move across the river, but due to the fall line, would still be located near the northwest border at a place now known as Point Reno. Not too far away from Miners Hill, you'll find a remnant of this past time in the shape of the boundary stones. This particular one is Southwest 9. They are all along the original district boundary, laid in after the Residence Act of 1790 was put into play. Most of them still exist, and if you're looking for a challenge, well, you can always visit as many as you can. While Miners Hill's reign as the district high point is far in its past, this place still has a unique claim to fame. As the highest point of Arlington County, it is the highest point of the smallest self-governing county in the United States. One of the things the district high points do a really good job illustrating is the arbitrary nature of high pointing. As boundaries change through history or better measurements are made, well, the title of highest point can shift as well. Both Miners Hill and Point Reno were places of no real significance throughout most of their existence. Even before colonization, the Native Americans that lived here, they were more interested in the lowlands at the bottom of the hills or the trails running to the side of them than the heights themselves. It wasn't until lines were put on the map that these places gained any real standing. As you may expect, DC's high point is one of the more urban ones. In fact, it's one of the only major high points that you can take the subway to. In this case, if you want to do that, take the Red Line to Tenleytown Station. Once there, you'll head up the escalator to the Tenleytown Metro Station. The long ride to the top will give you a bit of perspective. While it is not the tallest or longest escalator in DC, that'd be over the Wheaton Station, it does provide some context on just how high the fall line rises off the coastal plain. Once out of the station, it's just a short walk over to Fort Reno National Park. Point Reno's early days bear a lot of similarities to Miner Hill's. Both were farms. Miners Hill farmed by the Miner family, Point Reno by Giles Dyer. Both were places that people fled to when the British burned Washington in 1814. Both would then return to their agrarian roots. But by the time of the Civil War, their paths would diverge. Miners Hill would become an encampment and observation point. But Point Reno, it would take a more substantial role in the defense of the district. The Dyer farm would be seized by the U.S. government at the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War. The elevation of the property made it an ideal location to construct fortifications to defend the capital. The thought of Washington, D.C. falling into enemy hands was a very real threat. The capital was in a precarious position. The Confederacy was literally across the river to the south in Virginia, and its northern neighbor, Maryland, while it hadn't seceded, was still a slave state and had more than a few southern sympathies. This area would become one of the keystones to the district's defense and would be the largest fort constructed. Originally known as Fort Pennsylvania, the name was later changed to honor Major General Jesse Reno, who had been killed at the Battle of South Mountain in 1862. But this was just one of the defensive structures that was put up to make D.C. into one of the most fortified cities in the world. By 1865, there were 68 forts, 93 batteries, and over 800 cannons defending the district. Fortress Washington would only really be put to the test once during the war. In July 1864, Confederate General Jubal Early attacked from the north in Maryland with 22,000 men. The battle was focused on Fort Stevens. Despite being short-handed, the Washington defenses were able to hold back the Confederate assault. Fort Reno played a minimal but crucial role, providing the initial warnings, alerting the defenders. You won't find any evidence of Fort Reno anymore. The last bit of it, its earthen berms, disappearing when this structure right here, DC's first reservoir, was built in 1896. But despite the loss of Fort Reno, there are still 17 sites in the DC metro area that can provide a glimpse back in time to Fortress Washington. While the fort is no more, the name stuck and was soon used to describe the community that started emerging in the area. On the placard, you'll find mention that this area was a free town for former slaves after the war. What it doesn't mention, though, is what happened to that town. It's a piece of history that most would prefer to ignore. Not too far from the high point, you'll see this peculiar sight, a lone fire hydrant in a field. And you might wonder, what is it doing here? Well, the answer to that question is a sad chapter in this high point's history. This is one of the few reminders of a thriving, vibrant community that existed here 100 years ago. After the war, the Dyer family received their land back, but they didn't stick around. In 1867, they sold their property in lots for homes. It was advertised as Reno City, and over the next 50 years, black families would make their homes here, and the community would thrive. The challenges arose as the district continued to grow. By the turn of the 20th century, you start finding DC taking the shape that it is today, with the outskirts populated by elite, predominantly white neighborhoods. Reno Town, though, was the exception. Here was a developing and thriving black community. In the racially divided South, this was problematic for whites in the adjacent segregated neighborhoods. Reno Town was sitting on prime real estate, and white developers wanted it. They just had one problem: the land was already owned. Using the power of a racially biased bureaucracy and so-called citizens associations, the white neighborhoods began a concerted effort to oust the black community, lobbying Congress to passed legislation to condemn the neighborhood under the guise of putting in parks and schools. The black families in Reno town were basically given the option of either taking a pittance for their property or seeing it condemned and receiving nothing at all. By the 1940s, the community was all but gone, replaced by the Alice Deal School and the park we find today. By the 1920s, this place was starting to take the shape that we find it in today. But it wasn't quite finished with one of its old roles. In the early 1960s, Fort Reno would be called back into service for national defense once again. In the early 1960s, the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was threatening to turn hot. Tensions between the two superpowers had been ratcheting up with the construction of the Berlin Wall, Jupiter missiles in Turkey, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ensuring continuity of government became a priority, and the federal government decided to build a presidential emergency facility here at Fort Reno. Fort Reno was chosen for two reasons. First and most obvious was its elevation. Being the district high point meant it was ideally suited for the radio antenna that the facility would house. The other reason was the thought that the tower would blend in with its next door neighbor, the towers of the DC Reservoir. Personally, I don't think it does. Known as the Cartwheel Facility, this was a microwave transmission array that rose from a large fortified underground bunker. The theory was the president could move here and continue to exercise control over the government in case of war or national emergency. Like its predecessor, it too was part of a bigger network, this time with several like facilities stretching out to Raven Rock in Pennsylvania. By the 1970s, the DoD would rule the tower obsolete, and Fort Reno retired from military service yet again. But the tower itself, its days weren't quite finished. The DoD transferred it over to the Federal Aviation Administration, and it still finds use even today. These days, Fort Reno Park is operated by the National Park Service and has a variety of facilities and sports fields. It hosts such events as the DC Summer Concert Series. It's quite likely that the original highest point here has been lost to time, whether built over when Fort Reno was put into place or later bulldozed when the reservoir was installed. If you take in the area, you may think the high point is somewhere near the reservoir, but that would be incorrect. That area doesn't count, as the land has been altered by humans when the reservoir was constructed. And that is an important distinction to make, because we're here for the highest natural point. And to find that, we've got to go over a little bit to a different area in the park. Let's go check it out. In the past, finding the exact top of Point Reno could be a bit of a challenge. All you had to go on was a benchmark set in the ground at the summit. These days, it's a lot easier. Due to efforts of high pointers working with the National Park Service, several signs have been installed near the summit. And here we are on the summit of Point Reno, the highest natural point in the District of Columbia. With an elevation of 409 feet, if the district were a state, it'd put it between Delaware and Florida. I'm Skymar Thaler. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Rooftops of America. Before you go, click that red subscribe button below, and I'll see you soon.